I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to this seminar to Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. This lecture series is possible because of the generous support of the patrons of this channel. In fact, this entire channel is an experiment in crowd-funded university-level education made accessible completely for free. Open access, no paywalls. Access to reliable scholarly education on any topic shouldn't plunge anybody into thousands of dollars of debt, and I'm committed to making topics that I have expertise in and the history of Western esotericism as accessible to the public as possible. That said, if you benefit from the channel or from this course, I'd ask you to please consider supporting the channel for the production of free courses like this via a yearly contribution to my Patreon for as little as like $54 a year. It's basically a cup of coffee a month. But I genuinely appreciate your consideration for supporting this channel and making this kind of educational content possible. But to be clear, I am grateful for the work that I'm able to do, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this open access seminar, To Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. All right, everyone, I think we're now turning to perhaps a lecture that I think most people have been looking forward to, and that's kind of, we're now into the world of the Hekhalot. We've talked a little bit about who the descenders may have been, and unfortunately, the answer to that is we don't know, and we're probably not going to know. They remain mysterious to us. They've hidden themselves very well behind text and behind pseudepigrapha, and what they've left us is literature, and what this literature describes is a process of descent, and in that descent they arrive somewhere. They arrive in a place, and this place, which I'm going to call the Myth-Scape of the Hekhalot, is described in lots of different ways. And what I want to do is sort of orient you to the world, the Myth-Scape, as I'm calling it, of the world of the Hekhalot. So let's turn to some of that world, and it is a very strange world, and indeed I would argue it is an incredibly terrifying world. So the descenders, they really seek out what I would call one of the most radical tasks in the history of the Abrahamic religions. Whereas in the history of Abrahamic religions, the ability to go to God is unheard of. One does not go to God. One is not able to go to God. God is infinitely removed, infinitely distant. And the idea of going to God is insane, that God must use God's own infinite power to come to you, because the gap between the finiteness of the human being and the infiniteness of God can only be crossed by a miracle, can only be crossed by divine power. Because in some sense, that's a contradiction. You can't cross a space of infinity. You can't cross the space of transcendence. And the only thing that could do that be some kind of entity for whom the rules of logic or the rules of space simply don't apply. And therefore, it has always been thought that God must do the work of either God coming to you in the form of theophany, or God bringing you to God in the form of something like the afterlife, where God is always the one either moving or moving you. But in no circumstance, with very few exceptions, is there an idea that you get to do the movement. And the reason why is, I think, quite simple. It is hubristic, for one. It is maddeningly hubristic, chutzpah, we would say, that you can cross that gap of your own measure or of your own ability or with the magic powers or whatever. So first, it's this chutzpah, and the Greeks are full of stories about people like Icarus flying too close to the sun and this being their undoing. And secondly, the part of the worry that this is simply impossible is that the descender is just a mere finite human being. There's no way to approach God in God's transcendence. And so this task is the part of what is amazing and shocking and maybe even heretical about the descenders, is that they claim to have discovered a technology by which they can go to God. Right? They can cross that barrier. They can do it without necessarily without a divine invitation. They can be the active participants in the mystical process. And in this way, there's a connection here to last summer's Agrippa seminar. Because if you'll remember, that's part of what makes Agrippa so revolutionary, is that Agrippa says mystical states need not be passive. You need not wait around like Hildegard of Bingen for a horrifying headache and then God to wallop you with a vision. you can induce this vision, you can induce mysticism, you can induce going to God, you can induce communion with God, and you can do it through the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. And here we have a very tiny place where these two things are interestingly connected. But given that hubris, and I will say that it is a bit of hubris, but we need a little bit of hubris every now and then. What we have is we have a reverse polarity. Rather than waiting for traditional theophany, waiting for you to die and then go to God, what the descendants claim they can do, at great peril, to be sure, is that they can go to the divine themselves. And in this way, it makes it one of the most radical theological praxes in Western history, I would argue. I don't know of many other kinds of praxes in the Western world in which an individual human being in their lifetime can be said to, in some way, travel to the divine realm. But as we'll see, this comes at extraordinary peril, right? So it is not a journey that one betakes as an evening stroll. It is incredibly dangerous. And what I even say is the conception of heaven, right, the area where God dwells, we might say, is utterly unlike almost any other version of heaven offered in the Western imagination. In almost every other version of heaven, the place where the divine dwells, it is a realm of infinite safety. You go there and you don't die ever again. You don't suffer anymore, right? God will wipe away every tear and everything will be perfect. And that's the afterlife. And Judaism, right? You go into the infinite, you go to the Olam Haba, you go to Gan Eden, and it's wonderful and perfect. And you get to argue with rabbis forever because that's the only afterlife the rabbis can imagine. It's more arguing. In the Christian version, you go in with the angels in the Empyrean, and you are in constant worship and closeness with God, perhaps. And in Islam as well, the green bird and Jannah, you're perfumed and it's beautiful and everything is lovely with huris or whatever. In no version of that story is it a place completely out to get you, where every single element is there to trick you, to kill you, and not just to kill you, but to kill you in lots of different horrifying ways, hosted by angels who don't want you there and who are looking forward to, with a kind of glee, about the different ways they're going to rip you to shreds. This is not heaven. Whatever this is, right? I would say it looks a lot more like a Dante-esque hell than it does heaven under any imagination of what that looks like. And in this way, the Myth-Scape of the Hekhalot is also idiosyncratic. It offers us a vision of where God dwells that is awful, full of awe, awful, right? Not awesome, not some awe, full of awe, all full. And I think this is a unique vision into this Myth-Scape. So let's talk a bit about it. Now, we never get, as you can imagine, I have here the classic image of heaven, right? With the pearly gates, right? And you go in and it's all green. It looks like the Windows XP background forever. That's not what we're going to get in the world of Hekhalot, right? This image of heaven simply is not that at all. Now, what we do not get, and we should be unsurprised that we don't get, is that we don't get a unified travel guide to the Hekhalot. We don't get one vision of what the Hekhalot look like. We don't get one text that says, all right, you turn left at this angel, you go down the street, and there's a rainbow bridge, and underneath that, there's this guy, and you have to, we're not getting an atlas. What we get are stochastic glimpses into the world of the Hekhalot, and these glimpses are often not connected to each other, and in many ways, they don't even agree internally with each other in the literature. So what we get is kind of a spattering of imagery where that kind of establishes, in some ways, this is the various things that you need to concern yourself with, and you get some ideas of the geography, but mostly in terms of the perils that you will face in those geographies. And of course, in next week, we'll be turning to a specific analysis of the perils inside of the Hekhalot. So, but what they do share, what is universally shared across the Hekhalot literature, while they don't share a single vision of what the world of the Hekhalot looked like, what they do share in common is that it is a lethally inhospitable place for human beings. Human beings are not supposed to be there. You can only get there after going through very careful processes of purification. And even after those processes of purification, angelification, we would say, once you get there, you can still die very easily. And again, you know, you look at the odds of what happens in this literature when you get to the myth of the Pardes. You're looking at 1 in 4 odds of coming out of there in one piece. Either your mind will be fractured, you'll become a heretic and you'll be doomed forever, or you will die. You know, only Akiva comes in shalom and leaves in shalom, and comes in peace and leaves in peace. But we do get some ideas of what they share in common, and as I said, it is a lethally inhospitable place. But the general focus of the literature is on the Hekhalot, right? The 7-tiered palaces that seem to be something like concentric palaces moving inward. And at the center of those concentric palaces is the divine throne. And in that innermost Hechal, we have what the descenders are looking for. And what they're looking for is to gaze at the divine throne, to see the divine throne, to feast their eyes upon it, perhaps, and to see the king in his beauty, to use the language of the literature. They want to witness the king in his beauty and engage in shared union with the angels in the divine liturgy. So that's the core structure. The core structure is a 7-fold nested series of palaces, hechals, right, in the center of which is the divine throne. Now, I should point out that Maury Jones makes it clear that in the earliest strata of this literature, we're talking about a 3-fold palace. And that, of course, makes sense because the temple is also structured, the Jerusalem temple is also structured in the form of 3-fold holiness, the outer courtyard, the inner courtyard, and of course the Holy of Holies. And it's only the high priest that's allowed into the Holy of Holies, and that matches onto this structure here. I think the development of a 7-fold palace probably is the intrusion of Hellenistic astrological ideas, where the idea is somehow related to this number 7 is probably related, I suspect, again, speculation here, but I suspect it's related somehow to the structure of the visible heavens, that is to say, the sun and the moon and the visible planetae, the stars. So the world of the Hekhalot is deeply informed by the apocalyptic literature, especially the Enochian literature. And you'll remember, as we covered at the very beginning of this course, we covered some of those geographic features of the apocalyptic world. And one of the things that is very important in the Enochic literature is, of course, one, the centrality of the temple, the celestial temple, but also, if you'll remember back, the combination of meteorological features, which is to say there are places where things like rain and hail are stored, where lightning is stored, where maybe we have to imagine it's sort of up there and God grabs the lightning out of a room and throws it down to heaven, throws it down to earth. They're stored up there in these structures. So the first thing to say is that there's a meteorological phenomena that comes from the apocalyptic tradition. We're going to find that, of course, in the Hekhalot literature, but also we're going to find that there are these elemental structures in the Hekhalot that are primarily focused on some strange combinations of fire and ice. And of course, that is coming from the Enochian literature, where you'll recall Enoch imagines the temple to be composed both of fire and of ice. And again, we get this kind of mystical, paradoxical, elemental business, which is typical of mystical texts, where they like to sort of use paradox as a mechanism of short-circuiting the way that we normally think. But what we have are those elements of the apocalyptic mythscape coming from primarily from the Enochian literature, and now they're being transformed in a very programmatic way, in a very practical way, into the various aspects of the Hekhalot, because they're being transformed not from us seeing through the eyes of Enoch, where we look over there and we see this, and we look over there and we see that. They're being transformed not as us as spectators along with Enoch, but rather as readers of the text who are going to make that descent. And therefore, they take a much more practical angle as opposed to straight geographical descriptions. They're not interested in a kind of world building exercise that we might do if we're writing a fantasy novel or playing Dungeons and Dragons. They're interested in you going and doing it. And therefore the focus of the text is praxis oriented. And they're much more concerned about, you need to say this at this moment to avoid fate, blah, 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 blah. Right. So this is the reason why I think that, unlike the apocalyptic literature, which is very rich in terms of world building, in terms of mythscape, there's a kind of poverty of mythscape in the Hekhalot literature, because they're primarily focusing on what you'll encounter and then how you deal with what you encounter. That's what they're concerned about. The geography is in the service of the mystical practice, not geography in the interest of literature, because when geography is in the interest of literature, if you've ever read, the Game of Thrones, you can learn all kinds of things about the geography of Westeros. Well, they're not concerned about the geography of Westeros. They're concerned about how you get over the wall. That's what they're concerned about. And so this is a practical oriented kind of literature where there's a much, I think I would say, a more impoverished sense of geography, but we don't get nothing. So the text that gives us the largest, although quite vaguely stated, but the largest idea of what this world looks like is the text Masa Merkavah. And in that text, we're given a glimpse of a series of tiered roads. I sometimes even imagine them on top of each other is the way that I typically imagine them, but it's not clear exactly how they're oriented. But it's a system of tiered roads which crisscross various rivers. And these rivers contain fire, darkness, and hail. And so that's the first geographical feature that you kind of come to, is a world of sort of roads that form as bridges that crisscross all kinds of rivers of, I said, fire, darkness, and hail. We also get the storehouses. And the storehouses, again, are typical of the Enochic literature. And it's in those storehouses where we get meteorological phenomena. Storehouses of things like snow, storehouses of clouds, storehouses of lightning, and other kinds of hail. One of the things that all the literature says in common is there's a unique interest in hail. And you may wonder why hail. And I think that the reason why they're uniquely interested in hail is that it is completely paradoxical that hail exists given the ancient mindset. The world up there is made from fire. That's what they think is up there. There is fire and water. But when ice rains down from the heavens, it's just shockingly weird and terrifying. And further, and this will also persist into the European imagination, hail is able to ruin crops. It's ruined crops. You can have one hailstorm and lose an entire, it can be famine. You can lose an entire crop. And if you've ever seen the earliest images of witches in the European Middle Ages, they're almost always inducing hailstorms. Hail was just, it was the nuclear event in meteorology in the ancient world. And so the obsession and the interest in God being able to store up hail and then throw down hail from heavens was a unique object of horror for ancient peoples in terms of meteorological phenomena. It was uniquely terrifying, and it had again, these are agricultural people for whom food excesses are not something they always had, and a hailstorm could mean the difference between famine and not famine. So I think this is what militates this interest in hail. Further, along with a huge amount of angels, we'll talk about more in just a moment, there's a huge amount of angels in the heavens, and the scope of the world of the Hekhalot is massive. They typically will measure distances in the Hekhalot in the unit of the parsaot, the parasang. And the parasang, it depends on where you read about what the length of it is, but this is a unit of Persian measurement that's somewhere around 3 to 4 miles, or about 6 to 7 kilometers. But what they're trying to induce in you is a sense of enormous vastness, that it is myriad parasangs in length. So they're trying to induce in you a sense that this is just an enormous world, right? An enormous world. And it is a world where where most of what you're dealing with are rivers. And again, we have to think back to the image of rivers in the ancient world. Rivers induce the idea of sacredness, the idea of boundaries. Immersion in rivers was very common, but also rivers are dangerous. You have to understand that in the Palestinian world, the rivers could also, you could get situations of flash floods. and rivers can be extremely dangerous. Again, we take for granted the fact that we have reliable bridges here, and I say we have reliable bridges. I think most of them are probably rated at C or a C or less, and now in the United States. But we take for granted that we have reliable rivers. If you've ever had to walk across the river, like to get across a river, it's terrifying. I mean, the current of a river can overtake you in moments, and it's something that is just deeply terrifying if you've ever had to deal with a river in real life. Have you ever seen a big river like the Mississippi River? These are huge. And so the idea of rivers as a kind of extremely powerful thing that can kill you is a thing that we don't experience much anymore because we're alienated from them because we have bridges. But again, in the ancient world, crossing a river could be quite terrifying. Further, if you look at the night sky, right? If you look at the night sky without the light pollution we all experience now, what do you see in the sky? You see the Milky Way, which looks a bit like a river. And so the idea that there is a river in the sky is a perfectly reasonable thing to believe, or there are rivers in the sky is a perfectly reasonable thing to believe if you see the night sky as the ancient people saw it, not the way we see it. We're alienated from the night sky largely. But if you see the night sky the way they saw it, rivers in the sky was a very common motif indeed. So these tiers, these roads, it seems, at least in Merkavah, these rivers or these roads seem to ultimately reach up to the 7 Hekhalot. Now, how they reach the 7 Hekhalot isn't clear. Maaseh Merkavah doesn't really make it clear how they do that, but at some level they reach to the temples, the palaces where the gods live. And typically in this first instance, to get through these various roads that cross over all of these various rivers of darkness and hail and fire, you need an angelic escort, right? You need an angelic escort. You can't cross those vast spaces on your own. You need something to aid you. And typically the angelic agent that aids you is the angel Surya. Surya is the angel typically associated in almost all of these texts with making that first liminal jump, where you jump from this world to the world of the Hekhalot. You need an escort, and typically that escort is going to be the angel Surya. It's not universally the case, but I would say in the plurality of the Hekhalot literature, Surya is the angel that you basically invoke to get you from your finite position here on this earth across that gap where you begin to make the descent to the actual Hekhalot themselves. So Surya is going to be the person that does that. And in many texts like Hekhalot Rabati and Hekhalot Zutarti and other texts, you typically or even do that sometimes inside of a special wagon, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So you're not able to do it on your own. You're basically ferried, right? And again, this kind of image of being ferried across rivers, very classic imagery coming from Egyptian literature, from Greek literature, less so Babylonian literature. The Babylonians had a much more frightening relationship with the Tigris and Euphrates than the Egyptians did. But you have the idea that crossing rivers is going to get you from this world to the world of the Hekhalot. And that theme that you see, I think, pretty ubiquitously in the Eastern Mediterranean cultural system, you see it here in the world of the Hekhalot as well. So when you get there, right? So let's say you've crossed over that pretty vast area of the rivers and roads. You come to, I think, the Pardes, right? The Pardes is the walled garden in which is set the system of Hekhalot. So you come to a walled garden, and that is, I think, the Pardes that gets described in the Gemara, right? That's the walled garden around which, or in which, we're going to actually find the Hekhalot. Well, I say that, but the text never makes it clear that's the case, right? So at some point you encounter a garden. Now, this is where things are very complicated, because it seems like in the Pardes, in the garden, that's exactly where the text also describes the water ordeal, which we'll talk about at length next week. But in other cases, the water ordeal seems to take place either at the 6th or the 7th Hekal. So if it's the garden that you get to first, through which you actually enter into the Hekhalot, it seems like a very strange place to be, because it seems like the case that it's more that the actual water ordeal is later or further down, one might say, in the progression to the central Hekal, but the text is not at all again, you get these very strange, paradoxical inversions where you seem to encounter the same thing first, and then you encounter it later, but it's not clear where in the procession that one encounters the Pardes. But at any rate, it seems to either be at the very beginning of the seventh Hechal, or it's somehow related to the Pardes, which again would have been a walled garden surrounding the palaces of the divine. Typically, right? Typically, at each Hechal, one encounters between 2 and 8 angelic guardians per Hechal. So imagine the Hechal sort of like a box structure that in order to get into it, there seems to be one gate. And as you pass through that gate, there are somewhere between 2 and 8 angelic guardians at each gate. And what you have to do at every gate is that you have to show, either by speech or by showing them, you show them some kind of seal. And on that seal is written something. I suspect it's their name. And they typically have secret names. These are not known angelic names. These are angelic names that are otherwise unusual. If you want to take a look at Synopsis 206, this is the classic statement of them. And so you'll see these are the names of the guardians of the first palace. And you'll get a series of names. Name one of them. Again, I'll vocalize it, but I'm not sure how it's supposed to be vocalized. But it might be something like Kashariel. Right? And Kashariel isn't an angel that we know of otherwise in the Jewish angelology. But this angel, Kashariel, you would show the name, you show the seal of Kashariel to Kashariel, and that allows you to bypass that angel. And a big part of what seems to have been the praxis of the Hekhalot literature is committing a vast amount of angelic seals to memory and being able to use those seals, right, in order to bypass these angels. So you would, what it seems like happens, at least in Hekhalot Rabbati and somewhat in Zutarti, is that you show the angels a seal, and the last angel that you show the seal escorts you from one Hechal to the other. So that angel, so you'll show Surya escorts you to he's one of the guardians of the first. He will escort you once you show his seal into the second, and you start the process over again. You go down 8 more angels. Once you bypass the 8th angel, that angel becomes an escort and moves you into the next Hechal. So it seems like it's kind of a system of it's like a lock, right? You have to get every lock, the tumbler and every lock in the right position. And once you get the lock, the lock turns over, and the last angel becomes the escort to get you into the next Hechal. And again, I'm saying this, and I want you to please hear what I'm saying, is that I am filling in a lot of the gaps about what's going on here, right? None of this stuff is extremely clear. And so I'm trying to fill the gaps in with what I think is going on in the text as best I can. Other interpretations of which you may have and other scholars may have are absolutely reasonable and absolutely worthy of attention. I'm simply providing the one that makes the most sense to me, but please don't hear my analysis here as being in any way definitive. I've neither descended to the throne, nor do I fully understand these texts. So I can't speak on authority of either position. In many cases, in some of the cases in Hebrew, the seals are referred to as a chotam. And a chotam in Hebrew is a signet ring. So it could be the case, right, that what we might be dealing with here are something like seals as if they were on a signet ring. And so they may be, or maybe not a signet ring, but a seal that would be pressed into clay, of which we have numerous examples of what are called bullae from the ancient Israelite context and later. So it's something like seals, and it may be visual seals for reasons that I'll come back to later, because we have very similar seals in the Greek magical papyri context, which are visual elements often referred to as charactares. And these charactares you may have seen in the magical context, which look more like lines and little rings. And those lines and rings that you see all through the Greek magical papyri and in Jewish magic, they're also in Sefer HaRazim. Those magical symbols persist into Jewish magic all the way into contemporary times. So you're talking about a 2,000-year-long, at least, use of these magical signs, and they occur all the way into texts like Sefer Raziel. They also occur in Western magical texts, for instance, like the 3 books of occult philosophy by Agrippa. If you've ever seen the angelic alphabet, Malachim are the crossing of the river alphabet. Those symbols are perhaps also related somehow in a way that we don't fully understand. They may also be related to the seals being described here in this text. At any rate, right? So you go from Surya all the way through this system of angels, all the way until you get to the sixth Hechal. Now, at the sixth Hechal, there's a kind of problem. And again, we're going to talk about ordeals next week at length. But in the sixth Hechal, we know that the angels there seem to randomly attack people. Unlike the other ones that where you come before them, and you're, by the way, the reason why they don't kill you immediately when you come before them is why? Because you have an escort. You're there on someone else's authority, right? Surya has, it's like when you go to a party and you're there with a cool kid and no one questioned why you're there, right? They don't look at you weird because you're with the cool guy. Well, it's because you're with Surya, and Surya basically vouches for you and says he has the right credentials. And again, he's like, show your credentials. And then the next angel escorts you in and you do the same credential passing all the way till you get to the sixth Hechal. In the sixth Hechal, something strange happens here. For reasons that we don't fully understand, the angels of the sixth Hechal can attack and kill you for no reason. And in fact, this is one of the most famous stories in the literature that we'll come back to next week, is where we have an instance where some of the descendants are being indiscriminately killed despite the fact that they have the correct credentials. They have the correct seals. And what ends up happening is that Nehunya ben Hakana has to be taken out of the Hekhalot and consulted about what's going on with these angels, right? So just again, to reiterate this, even with the right credentials, the sixth Hechal is like the randomized version of this, where even having the right credentials does not guarantee that you'll be safe. So the sixth Hechal, for whatever reason, is dangerous because the system that has protected you all the way up through the first five doesn't work anymore. Doesn't work anymore. And this is a kind of trickery element that you'll find in these ordeals. That the ordeals are meant to not just vouch for the fact that you have the correct magical requirements, the seals, the names, etc., and not that you have the right purity requirements, that you've done all the correct things you need to do, in terms of fasting and not looking at menstruating women and eating bread that you've made by yourself and all the things we'll talk about when we get to the more practice-oriented sections. Those just get you in the door. That just gets you in the door, right? And then the magical system of the seals protects you along the journey. But in some cases, when you get the higher and higher in, it's not even enough that you have the correct Torah knowledge, that you have the right moral situation, that you're morally or ritually pure, is that the system itself, beginning of the sixth Hechal, the fifth and sixth Hechal, the system itself begins to actively engage in trickery. In fact, in one case in Hekhalot Zutarti, there is a moment where the angels that guard the seventh Hechal, they can actually put thoughts into your head. And they can put thoughts into your head that are incorrect thoughts, right? And the entire system, remember, Elisha ben Abuya, right? What happens is you see an angel sitting on the throne. You have to know that that's not God, right? Now, I don't know about you. If I just had, for the first time, showed up at the seventh Hechal after surviving all the things we're going to talk about in a minute, and I saw a gigantic, amazing, beautiful entity sitting on the throne in the seventh Hechal, well, guess what I would logically think that entity is? God. But that's exactly the kind of trickery that the Hekhalot literature does to you. It wants to say, I'm going to put inside of your head false beliefs, and you have to know that you're not thinking them. So the system is, by the very end of it, you get this sort of trickster God element, where the system is no longer just about you being righteous, you being pure. Purity just gets you in the door. Righteousness is you had to pass those tests anyway from the sixth to the seventh. But the question is, if you look at a room and the room is made of pure alabaster surrounded in light, and if you've ever seen very pure alabaster, which we'll see some pictures of in just a minute, of course you might think it's water. The system is there to kill you. So it's not enough for you to be memorized a bunch of magical stuff. It's not enough for you to be pure and to be knowledgeable. Is that you have to be discerning, right? You have to be discerning. You have to know what the truth is. And you have to be able to see past angelic intrusion into your own head, walls of alabaster that really aren't water, right? You have to be able to see past Metatron sitting on God's throne and thinking that's God. Discernment becomes the key virtue as you travel up, or down, I should say, into the seventh palace. Speaking of alabaster, The sixth palace, right? Once we get to the sixth palace, it's guarded by two very specific angels that get mentioned a good bit. There's the Prince of Silence named Dumael and an incredibly fearsome angel named Katspiel. These two are known. We know the vocalization for their names. And Katspiel seems to be one of the angels most likely to kill you. Katspiel is interesting in that this is the angel that opens the door to the sixth, leaving the sixth Hechal, and basically drops you off into the room of the alabaster. And in the room of the alabaster is where the water ordeal takes place. So this angel is basically putting you into an Indiana Jones style trap. And in some sense, happily doing so. Right? It seems like Katspiel especially, and by the way, that the Prince of Silence, Dumiel, there's a sense in which at this point, you're going to want to ask questions about how to get through the next ordeals. But notice what you're faced with. You're faced with an angel who is not going to answer you, right? You have to, in some sense, rely on your own discernment once you get there. Now, at the sixth palace, we have the water ordeal. We're going to talk a lot more about the water ordeal next week. But at any rate, the short version of it is you're surrounded in a room full of pure alabaster, which I imagine is bathed in light. And if you've ever seen alabaster with the wavy kind of form, in fact, the text even says that it appears as if a torrent of water is coming right at you. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever had the experience of, like, I don't know, having a bug crawling on you, or like seeing a snake in the grass when in fact it was just a coiled up rope, or it was just nothing. There's a kind of, like if I saw water coming right at me, a giant wave of water coming at me, and I honest to God thought it was water, I would flinch and I would cry out, water, water. And if you do that, you're doomed. You're doomed. That is one of the things that will doom you in the Hechal. So you have to be able to face a primal fear, the fear of drowning. And for anyone here who's ever almost drowned or got under the water or been hit by the wave or something, or been overcome by a wave or pulled out by undercurrent, you have to be able to overcome what I think is an extremely primal fear. And again, in the ancient Israelite mentality, and even in the Jewish mentality of this time, water doesn't represent just water. There's also a sense of chaos here. Right? There's some sense of this water represents some kind of primordial chaos that threatens to overwhelm you. And if you've ever had an experience of encountering chaos, that's terrifying. I'd rather deal with evil than chaos. With evil, you at least know what to do with evil, right? But with chaos, there's nothing you can do. You're just being overwhelmed by it. It's at the rate, right, that if assuming you survive the water ordeal, you get seated in a wagon of some kind, and you're escorted by some of the previous angels once you've done the water ordeal with shofar blasts. They basically announce the fact that you survived, and then you go from the sixth Hechal in the wagon to the seventh Hechal. Once you reach the seventh Hechal, things are not going to get any better for you, but at least at this point, the angels write your merits down on a banner, right? And on that banner, you get to put the banner in your wagon, and they continue to blow the shofar to announce you've arrived. So in some sense, at this point, they're like, congratulations, you've reached the last castle. Now it's going to get really, really bad. And when they reach the wagon reaches the seventh palace, here you have to present to the angels there's a very specific praxes for the seventh palace that we'll talk about, but there's a very specific type of seal that you have to use at the seventh palace. And that is called the Great Seal and the Fearsome Crown. Right? And it is a Hekhalot text. It's in the Davila reader, but it is a series of, again, angelic and magical names. And it's there that you deploy the Great Seal and the Fearsome Crown. And this allows you to enter the seventh Hechal. But if you're invited and you enter, then you're killed. You have to be invited. It's called the invitation ordeal. You have to be invited in and then resist going in. And if you resist going in, then the true invitation happens and you're actually allowed in. So again, even the invitation itself is a trick. This is a trick. And if you are able to get past this, and the angel that invites you in is an angel called Anaphiel. Anaphiel is a trickster angel, and he administers this business here. But I want to read for you, just very briefly, if I may, from Synopsis 2:13, what the seventh Hechal is like. And again, if you think you've arrived at anything resembling heaven, Listen to what the seventh Hechal is like. This is Synopsis 2:13. And at the gate to the seventh palace, all the mighty ones stand raging. They are frightening, powerful, hard, fearsome, and confounding. And confounding. Higher than mountains, sharper than hills. Their bows are drawn. Imagine standing in front of people bigger than mountains with gigantic bows and arrows, all pointed at you. At you. Their bows are drawn, and in their hands are sharp swords. And in their faces, lightning drips. Lightning drips off their faces and goes forth from their eyeballs, globes of fire from their nostrils, and torches of glowing coals from their mouth. They are wreathed with helmets and coats of mail and lances and spears hung on their arms for them. Their horses are horses of darkness, horses of deep darkness. That word deep darkness, Arafel, that's the same word used in the Exodus theophany for the darkness that hides God. They are horses or horses of deep darkness, horses of gloom, horses of fire, horses of blood, horses of hail, horses of iron, horses of the misty cloud. That's all theophany language, right? That's all Exodus theophany language. The horses on which they ride stand over mangers of fire filled with glowing juniper coals. Remember the glowing juniper coals? That's what Enoch is turned. Enoch's bones are turned into glowing juniper coals. And they eat glowing coals out of their mangers, a measure of about 40 seahs in one mouthful. That's huge. These mangers are massive. The measure of each mouth is 3 times as much of that as the gate of Caesarea, and the measure of the mouth of every single horse is 3 times more than the manger of Caesarea. These are horrifyingly gigantic horses eating fire. Horses made of blood. There are rivers of fire beside their mangers, and all the horses drink about the same full measure of a canal of water that is in the brook of Kidron, which brings out and joins the rainwater of Jerusalem. A cloud is above their heads, dripping blood above their heads and the heads of their horses. I mean, these angels are literally standing beneath clouds dripping. They're covered in blood. They're just standing. It's raining blood. This is Slayer, right? It's raining blood on these gigantic warriors. So is the nature of the guardians, of the character of the guardians of the gate of the seventh palace, and such is the gate of every single palace. All who descend to the chariot and ascend, and they are not hurt. Rather, they see all this Hamas. They see all this violence, right? That word Hamas, right? That's the same word used to describe the violence for which God destroyed the world with the flood. These angels are angels of that violence, a violence so extreme that when human beings did it, God destroyed the world, right? And they see all this violence and they descend safely. And they come and stand and testify to the fearsome and confounding sight, the like of which is not in all the palaces of flesh and blood. I want to impress upon you just how metal this is. Just make that very clear. No one will disagree with that. But the fear here is extreme terror. That's the sensation they're trying to evoke in the Descender. Even at the seventh palace, especially at the seventh palace, what you're going to encounter is a horrifying, nightmarish moment where literally angels bathed in blood, with lightning coming out of their eyes, are training their bows at you, who is exactly that big, right? This is the frightening world of the Hekhalot. And again, the beautiful images of alabaster here, right? If you stare at them long enough, they do start to look like they're moving, by the way. At any rate, the Myth-Scape of the 6th and the 7th Hechal is, I said, especially terrifying if you want to read it in Synopsis 2:13 to 15. And there are details of these angelic warriors and the various weaponry and the horses, as we just talked about. And the names of the Prince Guardians, these blood-soaked Marines with bows drawn, their names are all especially esoteric. And in fact, there's even a moment when Rabban Gamliel rebukes Rabbi Ishmael, again, he's a priest, one of the most important of the descenders, but Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, hey, you can't be telling all these people the names of these angels. Why? Because they have the explicit name in them. It requires you to say the explicit name to save their names. That is crucially important because there is exactly one person and exactly one time of the year where anyone is allowed to say the explicit name of God, and that is the high priest on Yom Kippur. These situations, the angels themselves are so close to God. And remember, think about a name like Michael, Michael, the one like God. That's literally what Michael means. Michael, the one like God. These angels are so close to God that they have the explicit name baked into their name. And this is a case where you're not allowed to say the explicit name ever. I'm not a high priest, right? I'm not it's not Yom Kippur yet. It will be in a couple days. But that's only in the Holy of Holies, right? Not quite in the Holy of Holies, right? But you're only allowed on that day. And this is a case where the descendants have to use the explicit divine name in the naming, the presentation of the name of these guardians. But we do get some list of their name. We get some sense of what their name was. 206 does contain their names. But also their seals and stuff have to be presented. And even in the text, I have to say here, right, the angelic names are not consistent. The names given in Hekhalot Rabbati don't match the ones given in Hekhalot Zutarti. How to solve that, I don't know. You may have to go descend and figure it out. I hope you come back. Probably you won't. But the names are all over the place. But once we reach the 7th Hechal, and assuming we have survived all of this, which we won't, then you present the Great Seal in the fearsome crown, right? And you enter after the water ordeal into the 7th Hechal, and it is then and only then that you gaze at the divine throne. That is when you've reached the end of the game, and you're able to witness the king in his beauty and gaze at the divine throne and enter into the angelic liturgy. Now, there are lots of other little lore elements, mythical elements that I'll mention that are worth knowing here. In Hekhalot Zutarti, we're told of a certain vestibule, that there's a curtain that seems to divide the world of the Hekhalot from the non-Hekhalot world, and that vestibule guarded by this curtain, the parochet. That parochet, by the way, it should be evincing in your imaginary the curtain of the Holy of Holies, right? Which is, by the way, 2 curtains. It's not actually 1 curtain, it's 2 curtains. The high priest had to do a little zigzag to get in there because you can't open it and see the inside of the Holy of Holies. The high priest had to zigzag through. But anyway, the parochet is a kind of barrier that you have to cross according to Hekhalot Zutarti. And in order to do that, you need something like a mezuzah. And Rabbi Akiva very briefly says that he carves something into the lintel, and by carving something into the lintel, which sounds like a mezuzah, you're able to go through the parochet, this curtain. But there are angels of violence, Hamas. There are these angels of violence that guard the parochet. So you got to get the right mezuzah and do that. There's another ordeal called the worship ordeal. This is the ordeal that you face when you go into the 7th Hechalot and you see Metatron sitting on the throne of God. You have to know that that's in fact not God. And apparently this is quite difficult, but the text does provide some ways by which Rabbi Akiva knew that Metatron was not God. And this is a thing, of course, Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya falls for, and he's condemned basically forever for this. There are some angels which can be made sympathetic to you. I don't think that they're inherently sympathetic to human beings, but in some ways they can be compelled to be sympathetic, perhaps through magical means. And these angels include, of course, Surya. Surya is the gateway angel that gets you from here to there, or at least allows you to begin the descent. And Azhaya is another angel that seems also to be able to allow for you to witness the divine throne. He's another escort angel. But most of the angels are there to kill you. So most of them are hostile, overwhelmingly hostile. So even the ones that aren't hostile, they're only non-hostile because you've passed certain benchmarks, and then they're able to basically bring you into the world of the Hekhalot. And in some cases, for instance, in Rabbi Akiva's case, the angels were hostile. All of them were hostile, and it was only because of God. The God intervened and said, basically, let the old man in, that Akiva was allowed to go in at all. So this is a case where in the Gemara, Akiva isn't able to get into the 7th Hechal of his own ability. He has to be basically shooed in by God. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that when you go through the gate, this I refer to this as a gate ordeal. When you go through the gate of the seventh Hechal, if you go through the middle of the gate, you'll be killed. You can only go into the gate on one side. So you basically have to hug the wall as you make your way into the seventh Hechal. I think what this is showing is that you can't just march into the throne room of God. Going through the center of it makes it feel like, it seems like you're entitled to walk in as if you own the place. You need to go in like a mouse, like the mouse that you are, the putrid drop that you are, slithering on the wall, right? Otherwise you'll get killed. So this is another look, again, the little pro tips you get in the text, right? These are like, if you've ever read, again, I'll show my age, you ever read the old video game magazines where there'd be like a little tip, it'd be like, hey, do this in this stage to bypass this. It's basically like, hey, don't go through the middle of the seventh Hechal. The angels will kill you. Go along the wall, go along the edge. So this one, also another thing that's important is that when you enter in the seventh Hechal, you have to do physical preparation when you enter. And what that involves is that you have to basically pack all of the orifices of your body with cotton. You have to pack your ears, your nose, and your anus. Because if you enter into the seventh Hechal without your ears, your nose, and your anus packed with cotton, your soul will literally leave your body. Like your soul, you will poop out your soul, you will fart your soul out, because your soul is completely terrified. It will kill you. I mean, literally, it is ripping your soul out of your rear end if you don't pack it with cotton. Now, again, I don't know if they physically ever packed their ears. You get kind of, Odyssey vibes here a little bit, right? But I don't know if they physically ever actually packed their body with this. But the idea that it is so terrifying that it can kill you, and you have to kill you in the sense of rip your soul out. You need to pack your orifices with wool, rather not cotton, wool. In order, and definitely don't pack it with wool and cotton. That's really bad. You can't have shodnets in your bum when you go into the seventh Hechal. Really bad. At any rate, that's a very bad joke. I'm sorry. At any rate, again, when you see these interesting things, like you need to pack your anus with wool to stop your soul from being ripped out, there's just something so visceral about that. And again, remember, if you read Hekhalot Zutarti and other texts, it's very clear that the angels who are close enough to God are literally subject to divine radiation such that it kills them. It literally knocks them over, and they have to be baptized in the river of fire to come back another time. It's like God emits such a lethal dose of radiation that if you get close enough, even if the angels get close enough, they're irradiated by this holiness, and this holiness irradiates them and kills them. And so, as you can imagine, can you imagine those gigantic angels soaked in blood being killed by God? And you're thinking, oh, I'm going to go in there and go sing with them. No, you pack your anus with wool because your soul can be ripped out of your body. It's a very reasonable thing to think. Third Enoch adds a couple of more elements to this. You get to see the righteous and the wicked dead. That's a unique feature of Third Enoch, where Enoch shows the righteous and the wicked dead. That does not happen in any other text. And also you get a glimpse of the unborn. This is an area in the Kabbalah known as the Guf, interestingly called the body for some reason. But in the Guf, there is said to be a finite number of souls. All the souls of everyone who will be born is in the Guf, and there's an angel that goes into the Guf and takes the souls out and puts them into the wombs of women. And that's why you have this little mark on your nose, because that's where the angel touches you to put your soul into your body from the Guf. And so the angel touches you. Because before that, the fetus is just referred to as ruach v'mayim, just wind and water. But once the wind and water are ensouled with a nefesh taken from the Guf, you become a person. So again, these are just other unique elements of the geography of the Hekhalot. Most of these are mentioned only in Third Enoch. You don't get those mentioned in the other Hekhalot literature to much degree. Lastly, or at least as we begin to wrap up for the day, the goal of all this, as I said before, right, is to see the king in his beauty. And what we also get as a unique part of the geography of the Hekhalot is the throne itself. And most importantly, the throne itself is described at length in Hekhalot Zutarti, in a text referred to as the Throne Midrash by Maury Jones. And it's in the Throne Midrash that the throne itself is described with certain kinds of divine names, and those divine names, or magical names, attend to every part of the throne. So the throne itself has its own geography, one element of which is that the throne contains the face of Jacob carved into it. And when God engages in the celestial liturgy, and when Israel engages in the celestial liturgy, God goes off the throne or bends over the throne and comes face to face with the face of Jacob and embraces and kisses the face of Jacob carved into the throne. And much has been made by Rafe Neese and by Elliot Wolfson that this kind of divine homoerotic union is very important, right? Because again, it's the face of Jacob, but Israel's often thought of as a woman in terms of the relationship of God and Israel. So it's a very gender-bending, kind of very queer, the act of a kind of hieros gamos in heaven. And in this hieros gamos, in this sacred marriage, God attends to the face of Jacob, holding and kissing the face of Jacob in the course of the divine liturgy. But the throne midrash is very similar in some cases, in some ways, to the Shiur Koma literature, which is pictured on the screen, because in the Shiur Koma literature, God's body is enumerated. All the different dimensions of God's body is enumerated, and there the throne, the dimensions of the throne are enumerated. It's not measured actually, but the divine names are given in the throne midrash in Synopsis 368. If you want to go read that. The other geographic element that's of great importance in this whole business is the body of God. The body of God represents some of the geography of the world of the Hekhalot. Now, I know for most of you, you're going to think Judaism rejects the idea that God has a body. It's one of the big things we sing in El Adon. God has no guf, right? Well, God does have a guf. God does have a body in this literature. And not only does God have a body, God's body is measured in that same unit, pasaot, and parasangs, and the dimensions of the distance between God's eyebrows and God's ears, and the height of God's sandals, the length of God's fingers, which are very long, by the way. All of these elements become geographical features of the world of the Hekhalot. So the Shiur Koma literature gives us a further geographical analysis of the world of Hekhalot by actually showing the geography of the divine body itself. Now, those elements of the Hekhalot literature, in terms of the Shiur Koma literature, the measurement of the vastness, this is going to horrify Maimonides. Horrify him. And perhaps the most famous book in Jewish philosophical history, the Moreh, the Guide of the Perplexed, was probably written, as argued by Menachem Kellner, as a response to this. Right? Menachem Kellner argues, and I think persuasively, that the entire project of the Moreh, if you've ever read it, which it's a slog, that the Moreh is meant to be a corrective to the geographizing of God's body as it's to be found in Merkavah Mysticism. Right? Now, what ends up happening is there's an anti-Maimonidean revolt, right? A revolt, and that anti-Maimonidean revolt we know better as Kabbalah. And guess what happens in Kabbalah? Those elements of the divine body, especially the divine head, are built into the most obscure sections of the Zohar. If you ever had the privilege and nightmare of studying the Idrot, and especially Sifra Tzniuta, the most obscure and difficult sections of the Zohar, you will have 100+ pages in the Daniel Matt translation going through how the various parts of God's beard connect into God's brain and the liquids that drip off the divine beard under the world. It is psychedelically wonderful. But those elements of the exploration of the part Sufim, the aspects of God's body, have their origins in the Shiur Koma, which of course have their origins in the Merkavah literature. We're going to talk more about that toward the end of the course, because we will be talking about that as the sort of twilight of how Merkavah mysticism is absorbed into Kabbalah, and we'll talk about that at length toward the end of the course. As we wrap for today, of course, Otherworldly journeys were just part of the program, as I mentioned, in the ancient Near East and especially in the late classical Mediterranean basin. You can think of Inanna's descent to the underworld. You can think of the Egyptian afterlife journeys, which are also, by the way, rather dangerous. By the New Kingdom, many of the afterlife journeys in the Egyptian literature are filled with things like lakes of fire, right? There are lakes of fire that you have to bypass. There are all kinds of angelic guardians or spirit guardians that you have to bypass. The very same kind of system of gates with guardians is to be found in texts like the Book of Coming Forth by Day, better known as the Book of the Dead, but also in the books of breathing and other texts. So there are clearly Egyptian precursors to this kind of literature. Another text, the Zoroastrian book of the Arda Viraf, is also a text where they go to the Arda Viraf goes into the underworld and sees various kinds of horrors there. It may have been an influence on Dante's Divine Comedy, but there's a Zoroastrian version of that. But I would argue that the closest parallel to this literature is to be found in the so-called Gnostic books of You. And I've put an image here, and I have a whole episode on the books of You, some of the most complex literature to come out of the ancient world. The Pistis Sophia and the books of You, I would argue, are some of the most complex books to be produced, cosmologically complex books to be produced. But in those literature, and again, if you want to go into it, I would recommend checking out my video about it and then going and reading yourself. But what you can see here on the screen are these are what are called treasuries of light. These are the various guardians that guard the treasures of light, and these are various seals that you have to use to transverse this treasury. So you enter into the treasury here. There are various angelic guardians that live here. You have to provide them with various seals and magical words, and then you're able to cross out of that. You're able to cross out of that treasury into another treasury, and there's like 150 something of these treasuries. The book doesn't describe all of them, but this is one of the only, if not the only, illustrated Gnostic book from antiquity. I would say that the books of You are very similar in many ways, many ways, to the Hekhalot literature. So I would recommend, if you're interested in this ascent, descent, guardian, magic, overlap literature, the Hekhalot literature is going to be a place, and the books of You are going to be an incredibly important place of this as well. But what makes the Hekhalot literature all the more interesting is that in the books of You, the Hermetic idea of ascent, in almost all of the other literature, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, you have to do what before you make the descent? You have to die. In almost all of the other literature, this is a post-mortem journey. This is a post-mortem journey. In the Hekhalot literature, you do it while you're alive, unless it kills you, right? You do it while you're alive. And not only do you do it while you're alive, according to Hekhalot Rabbati, you do it while you're alive, and you're obligated to come back and tell people about it, right? It goes from a purely esoteric praxis to an exoteric teaching. And you do it while you're alive, unless you die. There's lots of great opportunities here to be killed by angels. And what we will turn to next week are exactly the ordeals that face you in the world of the Hekhalot. There are environmental ordeals, there are trickster ordeals, there are invitation ordeals, there are all kinds of things that are traps meant to kill you in this world. And what that implies to me is that if there are traps, and those traps were set there by angels or by God, they could only set those traps if they anticipated what? People coming. You don't set traps if you don't think anyone's coming. It seems like, and this is what we also get in the literature, God has engineered the system to be dangerous, to be sure, but to be accessible. And this is what is fascinating about the text. The angels in the literature are thought of as terrifying, powerful, horrible, dangerous. And God is often described as glorified, right, powerful, sovereign. But God is also compassionate. God has invited you in to the Hekhalot, if you dare, but there is an accessibility here where you can do it while you're alive, and the traps are set there to make sure that you're worthy. But even the presence of the traps is an act of compassion by God, divine compassion. Why? Because the divine compassion, by setting the traps function as an invitation. You wouldn't set traps if you didn't think anyone was coming. There's a paradox here. The fearsome, horrifying reality of the Hekhalot, why would you make it so scary? Who are you trying to scare? God? Angels? The angels aren't scared of this. This is the world they live in. Why make it so fearsome? Right? You make it fearsome for people. Even the horrors of the Hekhalot act as an invitation. They're there to scare someone. Who are they there to scare? They're there to scare us. And therefore, when we look next week, beginning next week, at the ordeals that we will face, or someone will face, as you enter into the Hekhalot, we must balance out two contradictory notions. One, it's a nightmare up there, down there. And on the other hand, the nightmare of the Hekhalot is an invitation. Because if it weren't a nightmare, if we're just nothing or whatever, right? If we're just like a normal world, then who cares? It's been made that way on purpose. And if it's been made that way, it's been made that way to scare someone. And that someone has to be us. We're the only people, the only thing capable of making the journey. So as we go next week, we will go and face, at least in the literature, we'll face the ordeals. The ordeals are meant to kill us. And we should take that as something, an act of compassion.